Hello everyone. I don't know too many Czech words, but I know ahoy, so there you go. That's about all you're going to get in Czech, I'm afraid. My job today, I think, is to give you an overview about how best we're currently thinking about how psychedelic drugs work in the brain. And really the goal with our research at Imperial College London has been to really lay a platform in trying to determine how psychedelic drugs work in the brain in order to see how they can be used, how they can be utilized and applied. So that's where we're crossing over now. I'm very happy to say that we've started a depression trial with psilocybin. We've just screened our first 2 patients who seem to be eligible. I don't know if you heard the music when you were coming in, but that's actually music that we're going to be playing to our patients in the study. It's very relaxing. It gets more epic later on. So I think it'll do the job. Okay, I'll use this clicker. So what are psychedelics? The best way to define psychedelics biologically is that they all share a certain property in that they all stimulate a particular serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. And if you look at these different compounds, you've got DMT, which occurs, it's an ingredient in the Amazonian brew ayahuasca, and psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin, which of course is found in magic mushrooms. And you can see LSD at the top, which is a semi-synthetic compound derived from a fungus that grows on certain grasses. But what's striking, especially when you look at DMT and psilocin, is how similar they are in structure to a naturally occurring brain chemical which is involved in some very important functions in the brain. So it mediates things like sleep, it mediates mood. Classically, you probably are aware that when serotonin levels are low in the brain, generally that's associated with low mood. When serotonin levels are increased, then that's associated with elevations in mood. And also it modulates thinking as well, or cognition. So it's quite striking that such similar compounds can have such a dramatic effect on consciousness, and they all work via this particular serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. That leads you to consider, why is that receptor there? What does it do? And one interesting consideration or hypothesis is that it's there for changing the mind, essentially. And as I show later on, that's what psychedelics are associated with. Changes in one's conscious state, but also enduring changes that are interesting and potentially useful as well therapeutically. So why are psychedelic drugs interesting? Well, they have very profound, very marked effects on consciousness and also novel effects. So they alter consciousness in a dramatic way, but also in an interesting way. And these effects seem to be enduring. So a very nice study done by Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University in the United States showed that just a single high dose of psilocybin, just one dose of psilocybin, resulted in some 70% of the participants rating their experience in the top 5 most personally meaningful experiences of the whole of their lives. So just to put that in a context, people were saying things like, it was up there with the birth of my first child, or the death of an important family member. But also what's especially intriguing is that over a year on from this single experience, a large majority of the patients were still maintaining that that single experience with psilocybin was among the most profound experiences and most personally meaningful experiences of the whole of their lives. So clearly, something dramatic is happening and something enduring as well. So these drugs are really, interesting and powerful tools for understanding consciousness, understanding the mind, and understanding the brain basis of consciousness. So that's why they're important, that's why they're interesting. But more than that, there's increasing evidence that psychedelic drugs may be useful therapeutically. And this is your countryman, Stanislav Grof, who was actually the individual who really inspired me to study psychedelics in reading his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. If you haven't read it, you should. It's incredible. This is one of Stan Groff's wonderful quotes. And he says that psychedelics used responsibly and with proper caution would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology or the telescope for astronomy. He says that these tools make it possible to study important processes that under normal circumstances are not available for direct observation. So there's a couple of really profound things in what he's saying there, and it really speaks to why I found psychedelics such intriguing tools and potentially powerful scientific tools, in that they can provide access potentially to aspects of our psychology that otherwise we can't study. And if we can't study those, then they just fall out of mainstream psychology. And I would argue, that's what's happened. And actually, there's potential for, to some extent, a kind of revolution in psychology if we utilize psychedelics in order to understand better the mind. So Stan Groff was onto a good thing there. So what else do we know about how psychedelics work in the brain? Well, in the mid-1980s, it was discovered that the affinity of a psychedelic drug, or its stickiness, for the serotonin 2A receptor, this particular serotonin receptor, there's actually as many as 14 serotonin receptors, but there's a particular one the psychedelic drugs seem to produce their effects via or through. And so the stickier the drug for the serotonin 2A receptor, the greater its potency. And to help illustrate that, LSD has a very high affinity. It's very sticky for this serotonin 2A receptor, and it's incredibly potent. It's psychoactive in doses as low as 20 micrograms or less, which is pretty unique for psychoactive drugs. Also, we know where these serotonin 2A receptors are. They're very densely expressed in the cortex of the brain, so the more evolutionarily developed part of the brain, the outer layer of the brain. And you can see this PET image here, where the serotonin 2A receptors have been labeled, and then we can take this image and see where those receptors are. You can see that they're in the outer part of the brain. So when the principal goal of this research is to make a mapping between the psychology of the psychedelic state and what happens in the brain, then of course you can't ignore that other side of the coin. You have to do your best to break down what is a very complex state and do your best to understand the psychology. And so what I've done here is broken the state down into 4 different key components. You have the perceptual effects, things like the hallucinations, both the simple hallucinations, things like geometric patterns that are seen, also the more complex hallucinations, things like closed-eye visions or sort of dreamlike visions that can play out, that can be quite complex. They might include things like people or animals or landscapes with eyes closed. Also the cognitive effects, the way psychedelics alter thinking, increasing imagination, and also leading to some muddled thinking. The emotional effects are particularly interesting. These aren't party drugs. Psychedelics don't reliably, enhance mood. They actually seem to increase emotional ability or range, so people can go from particularly euphoric states to dysphoric states quite easily. So that's interesting. And also the effects on consciousness, quite abstract and difficult to define, but nevertheless, one of the principal effects of psychedelics, particularly in higher doses, is this thing that people describe as ego dissolution or ego disintegration. And it may be why these drugs are actually so interesting. It may be at the core of why they're particularly unique compounds. And also it may be at the core of why they may be therapeutic as well. It's something that we'll come back to as this talk goes on. Another way to try and understand the psychedelic state is to compare it to other states. And so, for example, it's been compared to dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. There's some evidence to support an association there. For example, if LSD is given either just before sleep onset or actually infused intravenously during sleep, it'll actually bring on dream sleep. It will bring on this rapid eye movement sleep. And it will also increase the vividness of dreams as they're reported upon awakening. Also that it's aggressive, sorry, aggressive, that's a Freudian slip, it's regressive. There's some reasons to think that the quality of consciousness in infants actually shares some similarities to consciousness in the psychedelic state. That it's similar to spiritual experiences and meditation. There's evidence to support neurobiological similarities between deep meditation, certain forms of meditation in the psychedelic state, that it's like certain aspects of psychosis, particularly early psychosis, that it shares some similarities to the aura, the dreamy state that people sometimes describe when they suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy. And also that if you stimulate certain regions of the brain, actually in the temporal lobes, the medial temporal lobes, you can produce experiences which again share some similarities with the psychedelic state. So you can induce things like distortions in visual perception, things like melting faces, and also vivid autobiographical recollections that you can also see in the psychedelic state. So let's skip on. So in terms of the research that we've done at Imperial, over the years we've done a ASL study with psilocybin. This measures brain blood flow. After that we went on to do a bold fMRI study which maps changes in oxygenated blood, and you get more data points with this technique. You can look at things like communication between different networks and different regions in the brain. Actually seems to be one of the most informative measures that we've used. Also magnetoencephalography, which is quite similar to EEG, MEG in this case. That gives us a lot more temporal resolution than we can get with fMRI. fMRI is quite a sluggish, quite a slow signal, whereas MEG gives us this very fine-grained temporal resolution. So what we've done in our most recent study with LSD is to combine these modalities. We've used both fMRI and MEG, and this is really quite nice. It's quite a comprehensive design because these two techniques complement each other. So what you don't get with fMRI, so you don't get the temporal resolution, you get with MEG, and what you don't get with MEG, which is the spatial resolution, the ability to see the whole of the brain, to see deep into the brain, you get with fMRI. You get very good spatial resolution with fMRI. So what I'm going to talk to you about in terms of our data is this LSD data. So we did a study in 20 healthy volunteers. It was completed in September. We gave 75 micrograms of LSD intravenously, which compares to about 100, 150 micrograms of LSD given orally. And as I said, we scanned them with fMRI and MEG. But before I explain our results, it's worth me giving a very brief overview of some principles about the brain in general and how the brain works. One important principle is that the brain seems to inhabit this optimal state in between the two extremes of order and chaos. So if the brain was to be too ordered, it would be like a frozen system. There would be no flexibility there. And there would be no real information in that system. Then at the other extreme, if the brain was too chaotic, no information could be held in it, and it would be too loose, too flexible, and nothing could be preserved. So what you see when you look at the brain, the dynamics in the brain, is that it shows something which is described as criticality, or it inhabits this critical state, this optimal state in between those two extremes. And what I've shown you there is a nice picture of Goldilocks. So you may know about the tale of Goldilocks when she was trying different porridges and she found one which was just right. So to help you understand this principle, you can think of this principle as the brain inhabiting a position which is just right, not too hot and not too cold. Also that the brain is predictive. This has become pretty much a given in cognitive neuroscience, that what the brain does to a large extent is to make inferences about information that comes into it via the senses. And so similar to the Gestalt principle that the brain generates a prediction or a hypothesis about what's coming into it. And this comes into play when we start to think about how psychedelics work. Another important principle is that the brain is organized in a hierarchical fashion. This is nicely demonstrated or exemplified by the visual system, where you have the lowest levels, right at the lowest level you have the retina, and then information is pushed through the thalamus, the gating system in the middle of the brain, back to the very back of the brain in the primary visual cortex, and that processes very low-level information, and as you move up, you have regions and modules that process more detailed information and complex information, things like objects and faces, for example. Another final principle that I'll tell you about is that the brain shows two different properties as it matures. It shows integration, so certain well-defined systems become better defined, they become tighter, they become more integrated, but also the brain begins to parcellate up. It begins to develop different distinct systems that subserve different distinct functions, like a system for attention, that'll be internally very highly integrated, but very well segregated or distinct from other systems in the brain. Similarly, you can think of the visual system and the auditory system for hearing. Those systems become segregated and separate and distinct, such that the functions that they subserve are distinct. If that wasn't the case, then there may be a confusion between those functions, the kind of thing that might explain experiences like synesthesia, for example. So these two important principles will come into play as I describe our results with LSD, which are very similar to what we found with psilocybin. And these principles of integration and segregation are particularly important. So in terms of the design, I've already introduced some of it. There's 20 healthy psychedelic experience volunteers, 4 females, a mean age of 31. They were scanned twice, once with placebo, which is just an inert substance. It was saline infused in, and we use that as the comparator state to the LSD state. People are scanned 2 weeks apart. They have both conditions, so they have the placebo and they have the LSD, and the order in which they get the LSD is balanced. So half of the group get LSD in their first visit and half of them get it in their second visit. The dose that we give is 75 micrograms of LSD, as I've said, and we focus on resting states, so we look at spontaneous brain activity, so that's ongoing brain activity, like what's happening in the room at the moment. So it isn't brain activity that's constrained by a particular task, it's just the sort of spontaneously ongoing brain activity. That's our focus. People generally lie in the scanner with their eyes closed, and we acquire the data. We also introduce some music listening, but unfortunately I won't have time to present that data, so I'll focus on the resting state data. So what you're seeing here is brain activity, and if you look at the top row there, you can see 2 signals. You can see one in green and one in orange. These are from 2 different regions of the brain. One is from the left motor cortex and one is from the right motor cortex. And what you can see is that those signals are correlated. They fluctuate in synchrony. They go up and down together. They're in phase. And that suggests that these regions belong to the same system. And it's a system that's integrated, working together in a coherent way. If we look at the bottom row, you can see 2 more signals, one in purple and one in orange. The orange is the left motor cortex again, and then we've got the purple one for the left visual system. And what you can see in this case is those signals aren't correlated. They're what we call orthogonal, which just simply means they're not correlated. And this is important because these systems are separate, they're segregated, they're distinct from each other, and they need to be because they do different functions. So hopefully that makes sense, and again it illustrates this difference between integration in the brain and segregation. So get ready for it. I think this is a scary slide. So these are our results, but what does it mean? So here you can see 12 different functionally meaningful and familiar brain networks. You can see the purple there, which is the color denoting and depicting the different networks. You can see the first 3 networks, they're visual networks, and then number 4 there, that's the auditory network. So all these different networks do different things. Then you can see bar charts underneath each network, and they represent 3 different measures. We have blood flow in red, in blue we have the integrity of the network, and in green we have something called signal variance, which is the amplitude of the signal within those networks. And the important results here are that blood flow was increased only in the visual cortex with LSD, No other network showed any significant changes in brain blood flow. Some went up, some went down. But what's more striking are the changes in network integrity and also the signal amplitude or variance within the networks. And what we saw there is this very comprehensive, very universal decrease in the integrity of these different networks and decrease in the signal amplitude. So one sort of inference on these results, which is really quite a simple inference, is that functionally meaningful brain networks display disintegration under LSD. We've also found very similar things with psilocybin, so it seems to be an important rule about how psychedelics work in the brain, that they disintegrate normally very well integrated brain networks. So what about the bottom row? You can see those matrices there. What do they mean? So they're looking at the way different networks talk to each other, or to break it down and make it more simple, they're looking at the degree of segregation between the different networks. And as I've said, these networks are normally very well segregated, and they need to be. But what you find with LSD, and what we've also found with psilocybin, is that that segregation decreases. So they become less distinct from each other. They kind of blend together and merge and cross over. So we've seen that with both drugs. So there's these two principles which can be quite nicely explained to you via metaphors, I think. I think that can be quite useful to help with comprehension. So if you can think of a system as like a city, and if you imagine that a city is normally well integrated and it functions, it works, there's organization within it. But imagine if that city was to collapse, imagine if it was to disintegrate. That's a useful metaphor, I think, for what psychedelic drugs are doing to the brain. Also, in terms of segregation, when I did a Google search for the opposite of segregation, I only found desegregation. And if you think about some of the phenomenology that's associated with the psychedelic state, for example, this sense of oneness or union that people describe, that may be related, perhaps, at least it's a hypothesis, it may be related to the way these networks that are normally well segregated become desegregated under the drugs. And how does this map onto the psychology? So, you know, one of the most important tools that we have in trying to make this mapping between the psychological state and the neurobiological state is to use correlations. So we look at the relationship between how the psychology is changing and how the biology is changing. And that's what we're seeing here. We're looking at a particular brain network called the default mode network, which seems to be associated with very high-level cognition, things like theory of mind, also self-reflection. Theory of mind is trying to take another person's point of view. Also imagination, so these very high-level, arguably species-specific cognitive functions. There's reasons to think that it may relate to things like one's sense of self or even one's sense of ego. And so what we did here was look at the relationship between the degree of disintegration specifically within the default mode network, and one of the items that people rated under LSD, which is I experienced a dissolution of myself or ego. And we found a significant correlation between the magnitude of the disintegration within the default mode network and these ratings of ego dissolution, supporting this idea that this may be one of the networks, perhaps the network, that is most closely associated with that very complex but nevertheless important aspect of human psychology, which is to have a sense of self. So the more this network dissolves, the greater people rate ego dissolution or ego disintegration. So to extend that, we looked at a particular node, a particular cog in this network, the parahippocampus. And we looked at the relationship between the strength of the communication between the parahippocampus and the rest of the brain, essentially. And what we found was that there was a split between the activity in the parahippocampus and these regions that you can see in blue. So the normally quite high level of communication between these networks was quite markedly decreased under LSD. And the greater the split, the greater the decrease in coupling or communication between these regions, the greater were people's ratings of ego dissolution. And this was actually a stronger correlation than we saw with disintegration within the default mode network. So it's useful because it extends, it advances on what we already know from or what we were already inferring about the default mode network and its relationship to ego disintegration. And it suggests that this particular circuit, this particular connection, seems to especially be important and implicated in this phenomenon of ego dissolution. So it's a tricky job, but we've made an attempt to explain this very complex, very abstract aspect of the psychedelic experience. But another, perhaps more tangible aspect is how they alter visual perception. So that's what we've done in this next analysis. And what we've done here is to define the primary visual cortex and a particular aspect of it, a region called V1, which is responsible for processing very low-level information like orientation, what's vertical and what's horizontal in our environment. And we use a paradigm, a behavioral paradigm, which identifies the V1 region. It's called a retinotopic mapping paradigm. So in defining this region in our group, we then ask the question, where in the brain does activity become more synchronous or more communicative with the V1 region under LSD versus placebo? And what you're seeing here, again, is a difference map. It's regions where there was actually greater communication between the V1 region under LSD than under placebo. And what's quite striking is that the effect's all in one direction, which is the opposite of what we just saw. It's actually increases in communication between the V1 region and all these regions in orange, and they're quite, quite profuse. It's a lot of the brain is becoming more connected to V1 under LSD. And then we ask, I think the obvious question is, well, does this relate to visual hallucinations? And what we found is that it does, and actually it relates in a very strong way. So we found these very strong correlations between ratings of elementary hallucinations, which are things like the geometric patterns that people see with their eyes closed, but also complex hallucinations as well, which are things like these dreamlike visions that people see. So the greater the increase in communication between V1 and all these regions in orange, the greater were the hallucinatory effects of LSD. So again, we think we're onto a good thing here, that it probably explains to a large extent the perceptual effects and the hallucinatory effects of psychedelic drugs. So what does this mean? How do we explain this mechanistically? And so what I'm doing here is reminding you about one of the principles about the way the brain is organized, that it has this hierarchical organization, and this is particularly exemplified by the visual system, which is what we just looked at. But imagine if that hierarchy was to collapse, and in such a scenario you may have inferences being called up without sensory information. So rather than our visual perception being tightly anchored to sensory information that comes into the brain, instead you have a kind of anarchic behavior going on, where information that's already held in the brain, like that there are faces in our environment, are called up and are experienced without the information coming in to call those experiences up. What I've described this as impetuous inference. Another word for impetuous might be impulsive or overly zealous inference, that these predictions are being made without the information actually there to call those inferences up. And there's the anarchic brain. So So what I'm doing there is speaking to these three principles that you could treat as kind of take-home messages about how we think empirical, how psychedelics work in the brain, that they cause system disintegration or collapse, if you want to call it that they cause system desegregation or unification, and also that they collapse the normal hierarchical structure of the brain, leading to a kind of anarchic behavior in brain function. Also, that the psychedelic state is regressive. So, in the sense that our behavior, our style of thinking becomes more like it is in childhood. You often see with psychedelics, especially when they're taken recreationally, that people spend a lot of time laughing at things, you know. They become quite immature, giggling at things. But also if you think about the emotion that's experienced in the psychedelic state, there's a greater range. You see a similar thing in infancy, that the children and younger can go from great extremes to being, you know, gleefully happy one minute to being crying their eyes out another minute. And this would speak to this disintegration that we see in brain networks. It's well established that during maturation, during normal development, the brain tends to kind of tighten up. But if you get a reversal of that, an inversion of that, that's a useful principle for understanding the psychedelic state. Another useful principle is this measure of entropy. And entropy is useful because it speaks to both subjective experience but also the underlying mechanics. So entropy is actually a measure of our uncertainty about a system when we sample it. So the higher entropy is, the greater is our uncertainty. But it also has a mechanistic aspect, because the greater the entropy, the more disordered the system. So there you can see that disorder and uncertainty are kind of synonyms. They're kind of equivalents. And it's quite useful to use this measure in the context of conscious states. We can think of what happens in the brain during maturation as a decrease in entropy, a decrease in uncertainty, an increase in confidence and assuredness about the way the world is, and also an increase in the organization of the brain. And what you see with psychedelics is an inversion or a reversal of that the brain becomes more disorganized, and also one experiences less confidence, less assuredness, and greater uncertainty. And what I've done here is just put a quote from a developmental psychologist, which I think speaks quite nicely to this idea of the psychedelic state and the state in infancy being like an entropic state in the brain. And the author says here that adults and children may differ in the strengths of their commitments, with children holding more diffuse or spread out beliefs, looser beliefs. This possibility is consistent with the difference between a low temperature and a high temperature system. To borrow an analogy from statistical physics, adults have congealed or become stuck together in their beliefs and are hard to shift, while children are more fluid and consequently more willing to entertain new ideas. So this principle could be useful in not just explaining the psychedelic state, but also potentially explaining how psychedelics could be useful, that they can increase the flexibility of thinking, perhaps even increase the flexibility of behavior, particularly in states where inflexible behavior is problematic, for example, in addiction. So that's quite a nice prelude to this slide, which is an overview of the therapeutic work that's going on at the moment with psychedelic drugs. And it's really amazing just to watch the number of studies, the number of papers that are coming out, and the rate that they're coming out and being published at the moment. So you have a number of studies looking at anxiety related to dying. Some really quite impressive results there, with decreases in anxiety scores and depression scores over 6 months after sometimes just a single administration of psilocybin. Also some impressive results looking at alcohol dependence with psilocybin, and also smoking addiction. So I think 6 months after 2 treatments with psilocybin, 80% of smokers were abstinent from smoking, which is pretty remarkable in the context of other treatments for tobacco addiction. Also depression, there's a study that's just come out looking at ayahuasca. It's just a small study in 6 patients, but it supports the efficacy of psilocybin in treating depression. As I've said, we just started our study at Imperial looking at psilocybin to treat depression. And also there was a study, an earlier study looking at psilocybin to treat obsessive compulsive disorder. So what you see with these studies is that psilocybin is often given just in a single dose or a small number of doses, and the beneficial effects are very impressive, and they also seem to be enduring. That's quite different from mainstream treatments in psychiatry, where they're often they have to be delivered in a chronic or in ongoing way, so medications may have to be taken every day, or psychotherapy has to be maintained and ongoing. So it's quite a sort of revolutionary model to think that just a single experience can change people's mental health for the better, potentially, and that these effects can be enduring. So, you know, what's going on in terms of the mechanisms? How do we explain this mechanistically? How's the brain changing to explain these enduring effects? So at the moment, nobody really knows. We can only make inferences. But some of those inferences are being made around the way that psychedelics increase disorder, essentially, in the brain, that they kind of, you can think of a snow globe shaking up the system. You can think of all these different psychopathologies, from depression, addiction, and OCD, as being somehow related, in that thinking and behavior can become entrenched, it can become stuck into particular pathological or unhealthy patterns. And what psychedelics seem to do is kind of reboot the system. They kind of shake up the system and allow it to operate in a more flexible way. And it may be this that explains how the drugs can be useful therapeutically. So what about other uses? I mean, certainly, given the prevalence of depression and also particularly alcohol dependence, the impact of psychedelics, if indeed they're shown to be effective and safe treatments for these disorders, the impact could be considerable. They could really change things in psychiatry. But it's worth thinking about other potential applications as well. There's a study that's shown that creative thinking is enhanced after participation in ayahuasca ceremonies. So highly original ideas were more prevalent after ayahuasca than after placebo, I think. Also, the cluster headaches, there's some anecdotal evidence that these very debilitating headaches, these extremely painful headaches that some people have that can't really be treated effectively by other means, do respond very well to LSD and psilocybin. So another thing that these drugs could be useful for. And other pathologies as well that haven't been considered so much, things like eating disorders and phobias, which again speak to that same kind of principle where behavior and thinking becomes kind of habitual and sort of stuck in certain patterns that aren't healthy, essentially. Also, an interesting idea, I showed you those metaphors for how psychedelics work in the brain, and they had political connotations. There were things like desegregation and anarchy in the mind. And it's been found that a single dose of psilocybin can alter personality in an enduring way. We've also seen similar things with LSD, albeit for a shorter period. But a particularly striking result was found by the Johns Hopkins team, Catherine McLean at Johns Hopkins. She found that the personality trait openness was significantly increased over a year after just one experience with psilocybin. So that's something that's pretty remarkable, in that personality is a very stable thing. You know, in adulthood, our personalities don't really change. If you measure it at one time and measure it at another time, you basically see the same thing. But with psilocybin, you get this significant increase in openness, and it lasts. It lasted with psilocybin. We found significant increases in both trait openness and conscientiousness after LSD. We've also seen increases in optimism as well after LSD. So these are alternative applications or additional applications of psychedelics that are especially interesting. So I'll end my talk there, and I just want to thank David Nutt and Amanda Fielding, who've given me the opportunity to study what I have always really wanted to study. Also the ground troops you can see there. And I'd also like to thank my hosts who've looked after me so well, Rita and Stander, and thank you all for your attention as well.